Talk. General election, new marriage law. 1857. No wave on the great ocean of time, when once it has floated past us, can be recalled. All we can do is to watch the new form and motion of the next, and launch upon it to try in the manner our best judgment may suggest our strength and skill. Gladstone. In spite of wise counsels of circumspection, Mr. Gladstone clung to the chances that might come from personal communication between himself and Lord Derby. Under pressure from his friends, he agreed with Lord Derby to put off an interview until after the debate on the address. Then, after Parliament met, they took the plunge. We are now at the beginning of February. This afternoon at 3 I called on Lord Derby and remained with him above 3 hours, in prosecution of the correspondence which had passed between us. I told him that I deliberately disapproved of the government of Lord Palmerston, and was prepared and desirous to aid in any proper measures which might lead to its displacement. That so strong were my objections that I was content to act thus without inquiring who was to follow, for I was convinced that anyone who might follow would govern with less prejudice to the public interests. That in the existing state of public affairs I did not pretend to see far, but thus far I saw clearly. I also told him that I felt the isolated position in which I stood, and indeed in which we who are called Peelites all stand, to be a great evil as tending to prolong and aggravate that parliamentary disorganization which so much clogs and weakens the working of our government, and I denounced myself as a public nuisance, adding that it would be an advantage if my doctor sent me abroad for the session. Peelites and Tories. He concurred in the general sentiments which I had expressed, but said it was material for him, as he had friends with and for whom to act, and as I had alluded to the possibility, in the event of a change, of his being invited by the Queen to form a government, to consider beforehand on what strength he could rely. He said he believed his friends were stronger than any other single section, but that they were a minority in both houses. Weak in 1852, he was weaker now, for it was natural that 4 years of exclusion from office should thin the ranks of a party, and such had been his case. He described the state of feeling among his friends, and adverted to the offer he had made in 1851 and in 1855. The fact of an overture made and not accepted had led to much bitterness or anger towards us among a portion of his adherents. He considered that in 1855 Lord Palmerston had behaved far from well either to Herbert and me, or to him. 357. Other interviews followed, resolutions were discussed, amendments, forms of words. They met at discreet dinners. Nobody, Lord Derby tells him, except Disraeli knows the length to which our communications have gone. Nobody, that is to say, excepting also Mr. Gladstone's 3 personal allies, them he kept accurately informed of all that passed at every stage. On February 13 the government presented their budget. In introducing his plan, Cornwall Lewis rashly quoted, and adopted as his own, the terrible heresy of Arthur Young, that to multiply the number of taxes is a step towards equality of burden, and that a good system of taxation is one that bears lightly on an infinite number of points. The reader will believe how speedily an impious opinion of this sort kindled volcanic flame in Mr. Gladstone's breast. He thought moreover that he espied in the ministerial plan a prospective deficiency a year ahead. To maintain a steady surplus of income over expenditure, he reflected, to lower indirect taxes when excessive in amount, for the relief of the people, and bearing in mind the reproductive power inherent in such operations, to simplify our fiscal system by concentrating its pressure on a few well-chosen articles of extended consumption, and to conciliate support to the income tax by marking its temporary character, and by associating it with beneficial changes in the tariff. These aims have been, for 15 years, the labor of our life. By this budget he found them in principle utterly reversed. He told his friends that the shade of Peel would appear to him if he did not oppose such plans with his whole strength. When the time came, February 3, the government was fired into from all quarters. Disraeli in front, Gladstone on flank, John Russell in rear. Disraeli and Gladstone rose at same time. Speaker called the former. Both spoke very well. It was a night of triumph for Gladstone. 358. There is another note of the proceedings on Lewis's budget. Saturday, February 14th. I was engaged to meet Graham, Herbert, and Cardwell at Lord Aberdeen's, and I knew from Lord Derby that he was to see his friends at noon. So I went to him on my way, first to point out the deficit of between 5 and 6 millions for 1858-9 which is created by this budget, with the augmentations of it in subsequent years, and secondly, to say that in my opinion it was hopeless to attack the scheme in detail, and that it must be resisted on the ground of deficit as a whole, to give a hope of success. I said that if among the opposition there still lingered a desire to revive and extend indirect taxation, I must allow that the government had bid high for support from those who entertained it, that it was the worst proposition I had ever heard from a Minister of Finance. At Lord Aberdeen's we examined the figures of the case, and drafted 2 resolutions which expressed our opinions. The more serious point, however, was that they all wished me to insist upon taking the motion into my own hands, and announcing this to Lord J. Russell as well as to Lord Derby. As to the second I had no difficulty. Could I have acceded to the first? But I did not doubt that Disraeli would still keep hold of so much of his notice of February 3 as had not been set aside by the budget. I said that from motives which I could neither describe nor conquer I was quite unable to undertake to enter into any squabble or competition with him for the possession of a post of prominence. We had much conversation on political prospects, Graham wishing to see me lead the Commons under Lord John as Prime Minister in the Lords, admitting that the same thing would do under Lord Derby, but for Disraeli, who could not be thrown away like a sucked orange, and I vehemently deploring our position, which I said, and they admitted, was generally condemned by the country. I again went to Derby, as he had requested, at 5, and he told me that he had had with him Malmesbury, Hardwicke, Disraeli, Packington, Walpole, Lytton. They had all agreed that the best motion would be a resolution, from Disraeli, on Monday, before the Speaker left the chair, which would virtually rest the question on deficit. I made 2 verbal suggestions on the resolution to improve its form. Cooperation with Mr. Disraeli. Late in the evening Lord Derby writes, enclosing a note received at dinner from Disraeli, I hope I may take it for granted that there is now a complete understanding between us as to the move on Monday night. My dear Lord, runs the note, I like the resolution as amended. It is improved. Yours ever, D. When Monday came, the move was duly made, and Gladstone and Disraeli again fought side by side as twin champions of the cause of reduced expenditure. Time had incensed Mr. Gladstone still further, and he conducted a terrific fusillade. He recounted how between 1842 and 1853 2 and 20 millions of taxation had been taken off without costing a farthing. A man may be glad and thankful to have been an Englishman and a member of the British Parliament during these years, bearing his part in so blessed a work. But if it be a blessed work, what are we to say of him who begins the undoing of it? The proposal of the government showed a gross, a glaring, an increasing deficiency, a deficiency unparalleled in the financial history of a quarter of a century. It was deluding the people and trifling with national interests. It is certain that no financier before or since ever, in Cromwellian phrase, made such a conscience of the matter, or ever found the task more thankless. 359. Great as was the effect of the close and searching argument that accompanied all this invective, even Mr. Gladstone's friends thought it too impassioned and too severe upon Lewis, in whose favour there was consequently a reaction. The cool minister contented himself with quoting Horace's lines upon the artist skilled in reproducing in his bronze fierce nails or flowing hair, yet who fails because he lacks the art to seize the whole. 360. At the end of February, 1857, at a party meeting of 160 members, Lord Derby told his men that the course taken by Mr. Disraeli upon the budget had been concerted with him and had his entire approval, spoke with admiration of Mr. Gladstone, justified political union when produced by men finding themselves drawn to the same lobby by identity of sentiment, and advised them not to decline such accession of strength as would place their party in a position to undertake the government of the country. The newspapers cried out that the long-expected coalition had at length really taken place. In their hearts, the Conservative managers were not sure that Mr. Gladstone's adhesion would not cost them too dearly. "He would only benefit us by his talents," says Lord Malmesbury, "for we should lose many of our supporters." The Duke of Beaufort, one of our staunchest adherents, told me at Longleat that if we coalesced with the Peelites he would leave the party, and I remember in 1855, when Lord Derby attempted to form a government and offered places to Gladstone and Herbert, that no less than 80 members of the House of Commons threatened to leave him. 361. All these schemes and calculations were destined to be rudely interrupted. 2. Speech on the China War. While he was acting with Lord Derby on the one hand, Mr. Gladstone sought counsel from Cobden on the other, having great confidence in his firmness and integrity of purpose, and hoping for support from him in face of a faint-hearted disposition to regard Lord Palmerston as a magician against whom it was vain to struggle. Events were speedily to show that Lord Palmerston had more magic at his disposal than his valiant foe believed. The agent of the British government in the China Seas, himself, by the way, a philosophic radical, had forced a war upon the Chinese. The cabinet supported him. On the motion of Cobden, the House censured the proceeding. Mr. Gladstone, whose hatred of high-handed iniquities in China had been stirred in early days, 362, as the reader may recall, made the most powerful speech in a remarkable debate. Gladstone rose at 9:30, Phillimore says, March 3, and delivered for nearly 2 hours an oration which enthralled the House, and which for argument, dignity, eloquence, and effect is unsurpassed by any of his former achievements. It won several votes. Nobody denies that his speech was the finest delivered in the memory of man in the House of Commons. Apart from a rigorous examination of circumstance and fact in the special case, as in the famous precedent of Don Pacifico 7 years before, he raised the dispute to higher planes and in most striking language. He examined it both by municipal and international law, and on the higher ground of natural justice, the justice which binds man to man, which is older than Christianity, because it was in the world before Christianity, which is broader than Christianity, because it extends to the world beyond Christianity, and which underlies Christianity, for Christianity itself appeals to it. War taken at the best is a frightful scourge upon the human race, but because it is so, the wisdom of ages has surrounded it with strict laws and usages, and has required formalities to be observed which shall act as a curb upon the wild passions of man. You have dispensed with all these precautions. You have turned a consul into a diplomatist, and that metamorphosed consul is forsooth to be at liberty to direct the whole might of England against the lives of a defenceless people. Disraeli in turn denounced proceedings which began in outrage and ended in ruin, mocked at no reform, new taxes, Canton blazing, Persia invaded, as the program of the Party of Progress and Civilization, and reprobated a prime minister who had professed almost every principle, and connected himself with almost every party. Palmerston replied by a stout piece of close argument, spiced by taunts about coalitions, combinations, and eloquent flourishes. But this time in Parliament his slender majority failed him. March 3, 57 spoke on Cobden's resolutions, and voted in 263 to 247, a division doing more honor to the House of Commons than any I ever remember. Home with C. and read Lord Ellesmere's Faust, being excited, which is rare with me. Diary. Lord Palmerston's triumph. The repulse was transient. The minister appealed to the constituencies, and won a striking triumph. Nearly all the Manchester politicians, with Bright and Cobden at their head, were ruthlessly dismissed, and the election was a glorious ratification not only of the little war among the Chinese junks, but of the great war against the Tsar of Russia, and of much besides. This, said Mr. Gladstone, was not an election like that of 1784, when Pitt appealed on the question whether the crown should be the slave of an oligarchic faction, nor like that of 1831, when Grey sought a judgment on reform, nor like that of 1852, when the issue was the expiring controversy of protection. The country was to decide not upon the Canton River, but whether it would or would not have Lord Palmerston for Prime Minister. The insolent barbarian wielding authority at Canton who had violated the British flag was indeed made to play his part. But the mainspring of the electoral victory was to be sought in the profound public weariness of the party dispersions of the last 11 years, in the determination that the country should be governed by men of intelligible opinions and definite views, in the resolution that the intermediate tints should disappear, in the conviction that Palmerston was the helmsman for the hour. The result was justly compared to the plebiscite taken in France 4 or 5 years earlier, whether they would have Louis Napoleon for emperor or not. It was computed that no fewer than 1/6, or at best 1/7, of the most conspicuous men in the former House of Commons were thrust out. The Derbyites were sure that the report of the coalition with the Peelites had done them irreparable harm, though their electioneering was independent. At Oxford, Mr. Gladstone was returned without opposition. On the other hand, his gallant attempt to save the seat of his brother-in-law in Flintshire failed, his many speeches met much rough interruption, and to his extreme mortification Sir Stephen Glynn was thrown out. The moral of the general election was undoubtedly a heavy shock to Mr. Gladstone, and he was fully conscious of the new awkwardness of his public position. Painful change seemed imminent even in his intimate relations with cherished friends. Sidney Herbert had written to him that as for Gladstone, Graham, and himself, they were not only broken up as a party, but the country intended to break them up and would resent any attempt at resuscitation. They ought on no account to reappear as a triumvirate on their old bench. Mr. Gladstone's reply discloses in some of its phrases a peculiar warmth of sensibility, of which he was not often wont to make much display. To Sidney Herbert. March 22, 1857, I did not reply to your letter when it arrived, because it touches principally upon subjects with respect to which I feel that my mind has been wrought into a state of sensitiveness which is excessive and morbid. For the last 11 years, with the exception of only 2 among them, the pains of political strife have not for us found their usual and proper compensation in the genial and extended sympathies of a great body of comrades, while suspicion, mistrust, and criticism have flanked us on both sides and in unusual measure. Our one comfort has been a concurrence of opinion which has been upon the whole remarkably close, and which has been cemented by the closer bonds of feeling and of friendship. The loss of this one comfort I have no strength to face. Contrary to your supposition, I have nothing with which to replace it, but the attachments, which began with political infancy, and which have lived through so many storms and so many subtler vicissitudes, will never be replaced. You will never be able to get away from me as long as I can cling to you, and if at length, urged by your conscience and deliberate judgment, you effect the operation, the result will not be to throw me into the staff of Lord Derby. I shall seek my duty, as well as consult my inclination, first, by absconding from what may be termed general politics, and secondly, by appearing, wherever I must appear, only in the ranks. I can neither give even the most qualified adhesion to the ministry of Lord Palmerston, nor follow the Liberal party in the abandonment of the very principles and pledges which were original and principal bonds of union with it. So, on the other hand, I never have had any hope of conservative reconstruction except, and that slender and remote, such as presupposed the cooperation, I am now speaking for the House of Commons only, of yourself and Graham in particular. By adopting reform as a watchword of present political action, he has certainly inserted a certain amount of gap between himself and me, which may come to be practically material or may not. If you make a gap upon this opportunity, I believe it will be a novelty in political history. It will be the first case on record of separation between 2 men, all of whose views upon every public question, political, administrative, or financial, are I believe in as exact accordance as under the laws of the human mind is possible. His leaning towards the Conservative Party seemed to become more decided rather than less. Lord Aberdeen had written to him as if the amalgamation of Peel's friends with the Liberal Party had practically taken place. If that be true, Mr. Gladstone replies, April 4, 1857, then I have been deceiving both the world and my constituents, and the deception has reached its climax within the last fortnight, during which I have been chosen without opposition to represent Oxford under a belief directly contrary in the minds of the majority of my constituents. He saw nothing but evil in Lord Palmerston's supremacy. That was his unending refrain. He tells one of his constituents, the state of things is likely to end in much political confusion if it is not stopped by the failure of Lord Palmerston's physical force, the only way of stopping it which I could view with regret, for I admire the pluck with which he fights against the infirmities of age, though in political and moral courage I have never seen a minister so deficient. Cobden asked him in the course of the first session of the new Parliament, to take up some position adverse to the ministers. I should not knowingly, Mr. Gladstone replies, June 16, 1857, allow any disgust with the state of public affairs to restrain me from the discharge of a public duty, but I arrived some time ago at the conclusion, which has guided my conduct since the dissolution, that the House of Commons would sooner and more healthily return to a sense of its own dignity and of its proper functions, if let alone by a person who had so thoroughly worried both it and the country as myself. 3. Divorce Bill. This stern resolve to hold aloof did not last. Towards the end of the session a subject was brought before Parliament that stirred him to the very depths of heart and conscience. It marked one more stage of the history of English laws in that immense process of the secularization of the state, against which, in his book of 1888, Mr. Gladstone had drawn up, with so much weight of reading and thought, a case so wholly unavailing. The legal doctrine of marriage had been established against the theological doctrine by Lord Hardwicke's famous Act of 1753, for that measure made the observance of certain requirements then set up by law essential to a good marriage. A further fundamental change had begun with the legislation of civil marriage in 1836. The conception of marriage underlying such a change obviously removed it from sacrament, or anything like a sacrament, to the bleak and frigid zone of civil contract. It was antagonistic, therefore, to the whole ecclesiastical theory of divorce. 363. A royal commission issued a report in 1853, setting forth the case against the existing system of dissolving marriage, and recommending radical changes. In the following year the cabinet of which Mr. Gladstone was a member framed and introduced a bill substantially conforming to these recommendations. For one reason or another it did not become law, nor did a bill of similar scope in 1856. In the interval of leisure that followed, Mr. Gladstone was pressed, perhaps by Bishop Wilberforce, thoroughly to consider the matter. With his prepossessions, there could be little doubt that he would incline to that view of marriage, and the terms and legal effects of loosening the marriage tie, that the Council of Trent had succeeded in making the general marriage law of Catholic Europe. The subject was one peculiarly calculated to interest and excite him. Religion and the Church were involved. It raised at our own hearths the eternal question of rendering to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to the Church what belongs to the Church. It was wrapped up with topics of history and of learning. It could not be discussed without that admixture of legality and ethics which delights a casuistic intellect. Above all, it went to the root both of that deepest of human relations, and of that particular branch of morals, in which Mr. Gladstone always felt the vividest concern. So, in short, being once called upon for a practical purpose to consider divorce and the many connected questions of remarriage, he was inevitably roused to a fervor on one side, not any less heated and intense than the fervor of the mighty Milton on the other side 2 centuries before. He began operations by an elaborate article in the Quarterly Review, 364. Here he flings himself upon the well-worn texts in the Bible familiar to the readers of Tetrachordon, if, indeed, Tetrachordon have any readers, with a dialectical acuteness and force that only make one wonder the more how a mind so powerful as Mr. Gladstone's could dream that, at that age of the world, men would suffer one of the most far-reaching of all our social problems, whatever be the right or wrong social solution. To be in the slightest degree affected by a Greek word or two of utterly disputable and unfixed significance. Interest in law of divorce. I may note in passing that in another department of supposed Levitical prohibition, the case of the wife's sister, he had in 1849 strongly argued against relaxation, mainly on the ground that it would involve an alteration of the law and doctrines of the Church of England, and therefore of the law of Christianity. 365. Experience and time revolutionized his point of view, and in 1869, in supporting a bill legalizing these marriages, he took the secular and utilitarian line, and said that 12 or 14 years earlier, about the time on which we are now engaged, he formed the opinion that it was the mass of the community to which we must look in dealing with such a question, and that the fairest course would be to legalize the marriage contracts in question, and legitimize their issue, leaving to each religious community the question of attaching to such marriages a religious character. 366. The Divorce Bill of 1857 was introduced in the Lords, and passed by them without effective resistance. It was supported by the Archbishop of Canterbury and 9 other prelates. Authorities no less exalted than Bishop Wilberforce were violently hostile, even at one stage carrying amendments, ultimately rejected, not only for prohibiting the intermarriage of the guilty parties, but actually imposing a fine or imprisonment on either of them. This, I fancy, is the high water mark of the ecclesiastical theory in the century. 367. Lord Mahone, in a letter to Mr. Gladstone at this date, pictures Macaulay's New Zealander being taken to the House of Lords and hearing learned lords and reverend prelates lay down the canon that marriage is indissoluble by the law of England and by the law of the Church. But who, he might have asked, are those 2 gentlemen listening so intently? Oh, these are 2 gentlemen whose marriages were dissolved last year. And that other man? Oh, he was divorced last week. And those 3 ladies? Oh, their marriages may in all probability be dissolved in another year or 2. Still, this view of the absurdity of existing practice did not make a convert. As soon as the bill came down to the House of Commons, Mr. Gladstone hastened up to London in the dog days. A companion in the railway carriage, he wrote to Mrs. Gladstone, more genial than congenial, offered me his Times, and then brandy. This was followed by a proposal to smoke, so that he had disabled me from objecting on personal grounds. Tobacco, brandy at odd hours, and the newspaper made a triple abomination in a single dose, for none of the 3 was ever a favorite article of his consumption. In London he found the counsels of his friends by no means encouraging for the great fight on which he was intent. They deprecated anything that would bring him into direct collision with Lord Palmerston. They urged that violent opposition now would be contrasted with his past silence, and with his own cabinet responsibility for the very same proposal. Nothing would be intelligible to the public, Lord Aberdeen said, beyond a carefully moderated course. But a carefully moderated course was the very last thing possible to Mr. Gladstone when the flame was once kindled, and he fought the bill with a holy wrath as vehement as the more worldly fury with which Henry Fox, from very different motives, had fought the Marriage Bill of 1753. The thought that stirred him was indicated in a phrase or 2 to his wife at Harden, July 31. Parliamentary affairs are very black, the poor church gets deeper and deeper into the mire. I am to speak tonight, it will do no good, and the fear grows upon me from year to year that when I finally leave Parliament, I shall not leave the great question of state and church better, but perhaps even worse, than I found it. Vehement opposition. The discussion of the bill in the Commons occupied no fewer than 18 sittings, more than one of them, according to the standard of those primitive times, inordinately long. In the 100 encounters between Mr. Gladstone and Bethel, polished phrase barely hid unchristian desire to retaliate and provoke. Bethel boldly taunted Mr. Gladstone with insincerity. Mr. Gladstone, with a vivacity very like downright anger, reproached Bethel with being a mere hewer of wood and drawer of water to the cabinet who forced the bill into his charge, with being disorderly and abusing the privileges of speech by accusations of insincerity, which have not only proceeded from his mouth but gleamed from those eloquent eyes of his, which have been continuously turned on me for the last 10 minutes, instead of being addressed to the chair. On every division those who affirmed the principle of the bill were at least 2 to 1. All we can do, Mr. Gladstone wrote to his wife, is to put shoulder to shoulder, and this, please God, we will do. Graham is with us, much to my delight, and much too, let me add, to my surprise. I am as thankful to be in Parliament for this, almost, as I was for the China vote. Yesterday 10.5 hours, rather angry, today with pacification, but still tough and prolonged. An unfriendly but not wholly unveracious chronicler says of this 10 hours sitting, August 14, on a single clause, including questions, explanations, and interlocutory suggestions, Mr. Gladstone made 29 speeches, some of them of considerable length. Sometimes he was argumentative, frequently ingenious and critical, often personal, and not less often indignant at the alleged personality of others. He made no pretense of thinking the principle of divorce a vinculo anything but an immense evil, but he still held himself free, if that view were repudiated, to consider the legislative question of dissolubility and its conditions. He resorted abundantly to what Palmerston called the old standard set-up form of objecting to any improvement, to say that it does not carry out all the improvements of which the matter in hand is susceptible. One of the complaints of which he made most was the inequality in the bill between the respective rights of husband and wife. It is the special and peculiar doctrines of the gospel, he said, respecting the personal relation of every Christian, whether man or woman, to the person of Christ, that form the firm, the broad, the indestructible basis of the equality of the sexes under the Christian law. Again, in the vast majority of instances where the woman falls into sin, she does so from motives less impure and ignoble than those of the man. He attacks with just vigor the limitation of legal cruelty in this case to the cruelty of mere force importing danger to life, limb, or health, though he was shocked in after years, as well he might be, at the grotesque excess to which the doctrine of mental cruelty has been carried in some states of the American Union. In this branch of the great controversy, at any rate, he speaks in a nobler and humaner temper than Milton, who writes with a tyrannical Jewish belief in the inferiority of women to men, and wives to husbands, that was in Mr. Gladstone's middle life slowly beginning to melt away in English public opinion. His second complaint, and in his eyes much the more urgent of the two, was the right conferred by the government bill upon divorced persons to claim marriage by a clergyman in a church, and still more bitterly did he resent the obligation imposed by the bill upon clergymen to perform such marriages. Here the fight was not wholly unsuccessful, and modifications were secured as the fruit of his efforts, narrowing and abating, though not removing, his grounds of objection. 368. 4. Death of Lady Lyttelton. Before the battle was over, he was torn away from the scene by a painful bereavement. Mrs. Gladstone was at Hagley nursing her beloved sister, Lady Lyttelton. He wrote to his wife in the fiercest hours of the fight, 11, Carlton House Terrace, August 15. I read too plainly in your letter of yesterday that your heart is heavy, and mine too is heavy along with yours. I have been in many minds about my duty today, and I am all but ready to break the bands even of the high obligations that have kept me here with reference to the marriage bill. You have only to speak the word by telegraph or otherwise, showing that I can help to give any of the support you need, and I come to you. As matters stand, I am wanted in the House today, and am wanted for the divorce bill again on Monday. Before Monday came, Lady Lyttelton was no more. 4 days after her death, Mr. Gladstone wrote to Mr. Arthur Gordon from Hagley.